The Plutonian Fire by O. Henry. There are a few editor men with whom I am privy, to come in contact. It has not been long since it was their habit to come in contact with me. There is a difference. They tell me that with a large number of the manuscripts that are submitted to them come advices, in the way of a boost, from the author asseverating that the incidents in the story are true. The destination of such contributions depends wholly upon the question of the enclosure of stamps. Some are returned, the rest are thrown on the floor in a corner on top of a pair of gum shoes, an overturned statue, head of the winged Victory, and a pile of old zines containing a picture of the editor in the act of reading the latest copy of Le Petit Journal. Right side up, you can tell by the illustrations. It is only a legend that there are waste baskets in editors' offices. Thus is truth held in disrepute. But in time truth and science and nature will adapt themselves to art. Things will happen logically, and the villain be comfort instead of being elected to the board of directors. But in the meantime fiction must not only be divorced from fact, but must pay alimony and be awarded custody of the press dispatches. This preamble is to warn you off the grade cross, and of a true story, being that it shall be told ply, with conjunctions substituted for adjectives wherever possible, and whatever evidences of style may appear in it shall be due to the linotype man. It is a story of the literary life in a great city, and it should be of interest to every author within a 20-mile radius of Gosport, Indiana, whose desk holds a MS story beginning thus. While the cheers following his nomination were still ringing through the old courthouse, Harwood broke away from the congratulating handclasps of his henchmen and hurried to Judge Cresswell's house to find Ida. Pettit came up out of Alabama to write fiction. The Southern papers had printed 8 of his stories under an editorial caption identifying the author as the son of the gallant Major Pettit, our former county attorney and hero of the Battle of Lookout Mountain. Pettit was a rugged fellow, with a kind of shame-faced culture, and my good friend. His father kept a general store in a little town called Hosea. Pettit had been raised in the pine woods and broom sedge fields adjacent thereto. He had in his gripsack 2 manuscript novels of the adventures in Picardy of one Gaston Laboulaye, Vicomte de Montrepose, in the year 1329. That's nothing. We all do that. And someday when we make a hit with the little sketch about a newsie and his lame dog, the editor prints the other one for us, or on us, as the saying is, and then we have to get a big valise and peddle those patent air draft gas burners. At $1.25, everybody should have him. I took Pettit to the Red Brick House, which was to appear in an article entitled Literary Landmarks of Old New York, someday when we got through with it. He engaged a room there, drawing on the general store for his expenses. I showed New York to him, and he did not mention how much narrower Broadway is than Lee Avenue in Hosea. This seemed a good sign, so I put the final test. Suppose you try your band at a descriptive arty, CLE, I suggested, giving your impressions of New York as seen from the Brooklyn Bridge. The fresh point of view, Don't be a fool, said Pettit. Let's go have some beer. On the whole, I rather like the city. We discovered and enjoyed the only true Bohemia. Every day and night we repaired to one of those palaces of marble and glass and tile work, where goes on a tremendous and sounding epic of life. Valhalla itself could not be more glorious and sonorous. The classic marble on which we ate, the great, light, flooded, vitreous front, adorned with snow-white scrolls, the grand Wagnerian din of clanking cups and bowls, the flashing staccato of brandishing cutlery, the piercing recitative of the white-aproned grub maidens at the morgue-like banquet tables, the recurrent leitmotif of the cash register. It was a gigantic, triumphant welding of art and sound, a deafening, soul-uplifting pageant of heroic and emblematic life. And the beans were only 10 cents. We wondered why our fellow artists cared to dine at sad little tables in their so-called Bohemian restaurants, and we shuddered lest they should seek out our resorts and make them conspicuous with their presence. Pettit wrote many stories, which the editors turned to him. He wrote love stories, a thing I have always kept free from, holding the belief that the well-known and popular sentiment is not properly a matter for publication, but something to be privately handled by the alienists and florists. But the editors had told him that they wanted love stories because they said the women read them. Now, the editors are wrong about that, of course. Women do not read the love stories in the magazines. They read the poker game stories and the recipes for cucumber lotion. The love stories are read by fat cigar drummers and little 10-year-old girls. I am not criticizing the judgment of editors. They are mostly very fine men, but a man can be but one man, with individual opinions and tastes. I knew 2 associate editors of a magazine who were wonderfully alike in almost everything. And yet one of them was very fond of Flaubert, while the other preferred gin. Pettit brought me his returned manuscripts, and we looked them over together to find out why they were not accepted. They seemed to me pretty fair stories, written in a good style, and ended, as they should, at the bottom of the last page. They were well constructed, and the events were marshaled in orderly and logical sequence. But I thought I detected a lack of living substance. It was much as if I gazed at a symmetrical array of presentable clamshells from which the succulent and vital inhabitants had been removed. I intimated that the author might do well to get better acquainted with his theme. "You sold a story last week," said Pettit, "about a gunfight in an Arizona mining town in which the hero drew his Colt's .45 and shot 7 bandits as fast as they came in the door. Now, if a 6-shooter could—" "Oh, well," said I, "that's different. Arizona is a long way from New York. I could have a man stabbed with a lariat or chased by a pair of Herreras if I wanted to, and it wouldn't be noticed until the usual error sharp from around McAdams Junction isolates the erratum and writes into the purse about it. But you are up against another proposition. This thing they call love is as common around New York as it is in Sheboygan during the young onion season. It may be mixed here with a little commercialism," they read Byron, "but they look up Bradstreet's, too, while they're among the bees, and Brigham also if they have time. But it's pretty much the same old internal disturbance everywhere. You can fool an editor with a fake picture of a cowboy mounting a pony with his left hand on the saddle horn, but you can't put him up a tree with a love story. So, you've got to fall in love and then write the real thing." Pettit did. I never knew whether he was taking my advice or whether B fell an accidental victim. There was a girl B had met at one of these studio contrivances, a glorious, impudent, lucid, open-minded girl with hair the color of Culmbacher and a good-natured way of despising you. She was a New York girl. Well, as the narrative style permits us to say frequently, Pettit went to pieces. All those pains, those lovers' doubts, those heartburnings and tremors of which B had written so unconvincingly were his. Talk about Shylock's pound of flesh. 25 pounds Cupid got from Pettit. Which is the usurer? One night Pettit came to my room exalted, pale and haggard but exalted. She had given him a jonquil. "Old Haas," said he, with a new smile flickering around his mouth, "I believe I could write that story tonight. The one, that is to win out. I can feel it. I don't know whether it will come out or not, but I can feel it." I pushed him out of my door. "Go to your room and write it," I ordered. "Else I can see your fin-ish. I told you this must come first. Write it tonight and put it under my door when it is done. Put it under my door tonight when it is finished. Don't keep it until tomorrow." I was reading my bully old pal Montaigne at 2 o'clock when I beard the sheets rustle under my door. I gathered them up and read the story. The hissing of geese, the languishing cooing of doves, the braying of donkeys, the chatter of irresponsible sparrows. These were in my mind's ear as I read. Suffering Sappho, I exclaimed to myself, is this the divine fire that is supposed to ignite genius and make it practicable in wage earning? The story was sentimental drivel, full of whim, pairing soft-heartedness and gushing egoism. All the art that Pettit had acquired was gone. A perusal of its buttery phrases would have made a cynic of a sighing chambermaid. In the morning Pettit came to my room. I read him his doom mercilessly. He laughed idiotically. "All right, old Haas," he said, cheerily, "make cigar lighters of it. What's the difference? I'm going to take her to lunch at Claremont today." There was about a month of it. And then Pettit came to me bearing an invisible mitten, with the fortitude of a dish rag. He talked of the grave in South America and prussic acid, and I lost an afternoon getting him straight. I took him out and saw that large and curative doses of whiskey were administered to him. I warned you this was a true story. Wear your white ribbons if only follow this tale. For 2 weeks, I fed him whiskey and Omar, and read to him regularly every evening the column in the evening paper that reveals the secrets of fey, male beauty. I recommend the treatment. After Pettit was cured, B wrote more stories. He recovered his old-time facility and did work just short of good enough. Then the curtain rose on the third act. A little, dark-eyed, silent girl from New Hampshire, who was studying applied design, fell deeply in love with him. She was the intense sort, but externally glacé, such as New England sometimes fools us with. Pettit liked her mildly and took her about a good deal. She worshipped him, and now and then ignored him. There came a climax when she tried to jump out of a window, and he had to save her by some perfunctory, unmeant wooing. Even I was shaken by the depths of the absorbing affection she showed. Home, friends, traditions, creeds went up like thistledown in the scale against her love. It was really posing. One night again Pettit sauntered in, yawning. As he had told me before, he said he felt that he could do a great story, and as before I hunted him to his room and saw him open his inkstand. At 1 o'clock the sheets of paper slid under my door. I read that story, and I jumped up, late as it was, with a whoop of joy. Old Pettit had done it. Just as though it lay there, red and bleeding, a woman's heart was written into the lines. You couldn't see the joining, but art, exquisite art, and pulsing tour had been combined into a love story that took you by the throat like the quinsy. I broke into Pettit's room and beat him on the back and called him names high up in the galaxy of the mortals that we admired. And Pettit yawned and begged to be allowed to sleep. On the morrow, I dragged him to an editor. The great man read, and rising, gave Pettit his hand. That was a decoration, a wreath of bay, and a guer ante of rent. And then old Pettit smiled slowly. I call him Clement Pettit now to myself. It's a miserable name to give a man, but it sounds better than it looks in print. I see, said old Pettit, as he took up his story and began tearing it into small strips. I see the game now. You can't write with ink, and you can't write with your own heart's blood, but you can write with the heart's blood of someone else. You have to be a cad before you can be an artist. Well, I am for old Alabama in the major store. Have you got a light, old hoss? I went with Pettit to the depot and died hard. Shakespeare's sonnets? I blurted, making a last stand. How about him? A cad, said Pettit. They give it to you, and you sell it, love, you know. I'd rather sell plows for father. But, I protested, you are reversing the decision of the world's greatest. Goodbye, old hoss, said Pettit. Critics, I continued. But, say, if the major can use a fairly good salesman and bookkeeper down there in the store, let me know, will you? The Pimienta Pancakes. By O. Henry. While we were rounding up a bunch of the Triangolo cattle in the Frio bottoms, a projecting branch of a dead mesquite caught my wooden stirrup and gave my ankle a wrench that laid me up in camp for a week. On the third day of my compulsory idleness, I crawled out near the grub wagon and reclined helpless under the conversational fire of Judson Odom, the camp cook. Judd was a monologist by nature, whom destiny, with customary blundering, had set in a profession wherein he was bereaved, for the greater portion of his time, of an audience. Therefore, I was manna in the desert of Judd's obmutescence. Betimes I was stirred by invalid longings for something to eat that did not come under the caption of grub. I had visions of the maternal pantry, deep as first love, and wild with all regret, and then I asked, Judd, can you make pancakes? Judd laid down his 6-shooter, with which he was preparing to pound an antelope steak, and stood over me in what I felt to be a menacing attitude. He further endorsed my impression that his pose was resentful by fixing upon me with his light blue eyes a look of cold suspicion. Say, you, he said, with candid, though not excessive choler. Did you mean that straight, or was you trying to throw the gaff into me? Some of the boys been telling you about me and that pancake racket? No, Judd, I said, sincerely, I meant it. It seems to me I'd swap my pony and saddle for a stack of buttered brown pancakes with some first crop, open kettle, New Orleans sweetening. Was there a story about pancakes? Judd was mollified at once when he saw that I had not been dealing in illusions. He brought some mysterious bags and tin boxes from the grub wagon and set them in the shade of the hackberry where I lay reclined. I watched him as he began to arrange them leisurely and untie their many strings. "No, not a story," said Judd as he worked, "but just the logical disclosures in the case of me and that pink-eyed snoozer from Mired Mule, Canada, and Miss Willella Learite. I don't mind telling you. I was punching then for old Bill Toomey on the San Miguel. One day, I gets all ensnared up in aspirations for to eat some grub that hasn't ever mooed or bawed or grunted or been in peck measures. So, I gets on my bronc and pushes the wind for Uncle Emsley Telfair's store at the Pimienta crossing on the Nueces. About 3 in the afternoon I throwed my bridle rein over a mesquite limb and walked the last 20 yards into Uncle Emsley's store. I got up on the counter and told Uncle Emsley that the signs pointed to the devastation of the fruit crop of the world. In a minute, I had a bag of crackers and a long-handled spoon, with an open can each of apricots and pineapples and cherries and greengages beside of me with Uncle Emsley busy, chopping away with the hatchet at the yellow clings. I was feeling like Adam before the apple stampede, and was digging my spurs into the side of the counter and working with my 24-inch spoon when I happened to look out of the window into the yard of Uncle Emsley's house, which was next to the store. There was a girl standing there, an imported girl with fixings on, philandering with a croquet maul and amusing herself by watching my style of encouraging the fruit canning industry. I slid off the counter and delivered up my shovel to Uncle Emsley. "That's my niece," says he, "Miss Willella Learite, down from Palestine on a visit. Do you want that I should make you acquainted?" The Holy Land, I says to myself, my thoughts milling some as I tried to run him into the corral. Why not? There was sure angels in pails. Why, yes, Uncle Emsley, I says out loud, I'd be awful edified to meet Miss Learite. So Uncle Emsley took me out in the yard and gave us each other's entitlements. I never was shy about women. I never could understand why some men who can break a Mustang before breakfast and shave in the dark get all left-handed and full of perspiration and excuses when they see a bolt of calico draped around what belongs to it. Inside of 8 minutes me and Miss Willella was aggravating the croquet balls around as amiable as second cousins. She gave me a dig about the quantity of canned fruit I had eaten, and I got back at her, flat-footed, about how a certain lady named Eve started the fruit trouble in the first free grass pasture over in Palestine. "Wasn't it?" says I, as easy and pat as roping a 1-year-old. That was how I acquired cordiality for the proximities of Miss Willella Learite, and the disposition grew larger as time passed. She was stopping at Pimienta Crossing for her health, which was very good, and for the climate, which was 40% hotter than Palestine. I rode over to see her once every week for a while, and then I figured it out that if I doubled the number of trips I would see her twice as often. One week I slipped in a 3rd trip, and that's where the pancakes and the pink-eyed snoozer busted into the game. That evening, while I sat on the counter with a peach and 2 damsons in my mouth, I asked Uncle Emsley how Miss Willella was. "Why," says Uncle Emsley, "she's gone riding with Jackson Bird, the sheep man from over at Mired Mule, Canada." I swallowed the peach seed and the 2 damson seeds. I guess somebody held the counter by the bridle while I got off, and then I walked out straight ahead till I butted against the mesquite where my roan was tied. "She's gone riding," I whisper in my Bronx ear, "with Birdstone Jack, the hired mule from Sheep Man's Canada. Did you get that, old leather and gallops?" That bronc of mine wept in his way. He'd been raised a cow pony and he didn't care for snoozers. I went back and said to Uncle Emsley, "Did you say a sheep man?" "I said a sheep man," says Uncle Emsley again. "You must have heard tell of Jackson Bird. He's got 8 sections of grazing and 4,000 head of the finest merinos south of the Arctic Circle." I went out and sat on the ground in the shade of the store and leaned against a prickly pear. I sifted sand into my boots with unthinking hands while I soliloquized a quantity about this bird with the Jackson plumage to his name. I never had believed in harming sheepmen. I see one day, reading a Latin grammar on horseback, and I never touched him. They never irritated me like they do most cowmen. You wouldn't go to work now and impair and disfigure snoozers, would you? That eat on tables and wear little shoes and speak to you on subjects? I had always let him pass, just as you would a jackrabbit, with a polite word and a guess about the weather, but no stopping to swap canteens. I never thought it was worthwhile to be hostile with a snoozer, and because I'd been lenient and let him live, here was one going around riding with Miss Willella Learite. An hour by sun they come loping back, and stopped at Uncle Emsley's gate. The sheep person helped her off, and they stood throwing each other sentences all spriteful and sagacious for a while. And then this feathered Jackson flies up in his saddle and raises his little stewpot of a hat, and trots off in the direction of his mutton ranch. By this time I had turned the sand out of my boots and unpinned myself from the prickly pear. And by the time he gets half a mile out of Pimienta, I single-foots up beside him on my bronc. I said that Snoozer was pink-eyed, but he wasn't. His seeing arrangement was gray enough, but his eyelashes was pink and his hair was sandy, and that gave you the idea. Sheep man? He wasn't more than a lamb man. Anyhow, a little thing with his neck involved in a yellow silk handkerchief and shoes tied up in bow knots. Afternoon, says I to him. You now ride with the equestrian who is commonly called Dead Moral Certainty Judson, on account of the way I shoot. When I want a stranger to know me, I always introduce myself before the draw, for I never did like to shake hands with ghosts. Ah, says he, just like that. I'm glad to know you, Mr. Judson. I'm Jackson Bird, from over at Mired Mule Ranch. Just then one of my eyes saw a roadrunner skipping down the hill with a young tarantula in his bill, and the other I noticed a rabbit hawk sitting on a dead limb in a water elm. I popped over one after the other with my .45, just to show him. 2 out of 3, says I. Birds just naturally seem to draw my fire wherever I go. Nice shooting, says the sheep man, without a flutter. But don't you sometimes ever miss the third shot? Elegant fine rain that was last week for the young grass, Mr. Judson, says he. Willie, says I, riding over close to his palfrey, your infatuated parents may have denounced you by the name of Jackson, but you sure molted into a twittering Willie. Let us slough off this here analysis of rain and the elements, and get down to talk that is outside the vocabulary of parrots. That is a bad habit you have got of riding with young ladies over at Pimienta. I've known birds, says I, to be served on toast for less than that. Miss Willella, says I, don't ever want any nest made out of sheep's wool by a tomtit of the Jacksonian branch of ornithology. Now, are you going to quit, or do you wish for to gallop up against this dead moral certainty attachment to my name, which is good for 2 hyphens and at least 1 set of funeral obsequies? Jackson Bird flushed up some, and then he laughed. Why, Mr. Judson, says he, you've got the wrong idea. I've called on Miss Learite a few times, but not for the purpose you imagine. My object is purely a gastronomical one. I reached for my gun. Any coyote, says I, that would boast of dishonorable. Wait a minute, says this bird, till I explain. What would I do with a wife? If you ever saw that ranch of mine, I do my own cooking and mending. Eating, that's all the pleasure I get out of sheep raising. Mr. Judson, did you ever taste the pancakes that Miss Learite makes? Me? No, I told him. I never was advised that she was up to any culinary maneuvers. They're golden sunshine, says he, honey-browned by the ambrosial fires of Epicurus. I'd give 2 years of my life to get the recipe for making them pancakes. That's what I went to see Miss Learite for, says Jackson Bird, but I haven't been able to get it from her. It's an old recipe that's been in the family for 75 years. They hand it down from one generation to another, but they don't give it away to outsiders. If I could get that recipe, so I could make them pancakes for myself on my ranch, I'd be a happy man, says Bird. Are you sure, I says to him, that it ain't the hand that mixes the pancakes that you're after? Sure, says Jackson. Miss Learite is a mighty nice girl, but I can assure you my intentions go no further than the gastro. But he seen my hand going down to my holster, and he changed his similitude, then the desire to procure a copy of the pancake recipe, he finishes. You ain't such a bad little man, says I, trying to be fair. I was thinking some of making orphans of your sheep, but I'll let you fly away this time. But you stick to pancakes, says I, as close as the middle one of a stack, and don't go and mistake sentiments for syrup, or there'll be singing at your ranch, and you won't hear it. To convince you that I am sincere, says the sheep man. I'll ask you to help me. Miss Learite and you being closer friends, maybe she would do for you what she wouldn't for me. If you will get me a copy of that pancake recipe, I give you my word that I'll never call upon her again. That's fair, I says, and I shook hands with Jackson Bird. I'll get it for you if I can, and glad to oblige. And he turned off down the big pear flat on the Piedra, in the direction of Mired Mule, and I steered northwest for Old Bill Toomey's ranch. It was 5 days afterward when I got another chance to ride over to Pimienta. Miss Willella and me passed a gratifying evening at Uncle Emsley's. She sang some, and exasperated the piano quite a lot with quotations from the operas. I gave imitations of a rattlesnake, and told her about Snaky McPhee's new way of skinning cows, and described the trip I made to St. Louis once. We was getting along in one another's estimations fine. Thinks I, if Jackson Bird can now be persuaded to migrate, I win. I recollect his promise about the pancake receipt, and I thinks I will persuade it from Miss Willella and give it to him. And then if I catches Birdie off of Mired Mule again, I'll make him hop the twig. So, along about 10 o'clock, I put on a wheedling smile and says to Miss Willella, now, if there's anything I do like better than the sight of a red steer on green grass, it's the taste of a nice hot pancake smothered in sugar house molasses. Miss Willella gives a little jump on the piano stool and looked at me curious. Yes, says she, they're real nice. What did you say was the name of that street in St. Louis, Mr. Odom, where you lost your hat? Pancake Avenue, says I, with a wink, to show her that I was on about the family receipt, and couldn't be side-corralled off of the subject. Come now, Miss Willella, I says, let's hear how you make him. Pancakes is just whirling in my head like wagon wheels. Start her off, now pound of flour, 8 dozen eggs, and so on. How does the catalog of constituents run? Excuse me for a moment, please, says Miss Willella, and she gives me a quick kind of sideways look and slides off the stool. She ambled out into the other room, and directly Uncle Emsley comes in his shirt sleeves, with a pitcher of water. He turns around to get a glass on the table, and I see a .45 in his hip pocket. Great post, holes, thinks I, but here's a family thinks a heap of cooking receipts, protecting it with firearms. I've known outfits that wouldn't do that much by a family feud. Drink this here down, says Uncle Emsley, handing me the glass of water. You've rid too far today, Judd, and got yourself overexcited. Try to think about something else now. Do you know how to make them pancakes, Uncle Emsley? I asked. Well, I'm not as apprised in the anatomy of them as some, says Uncle Emsley, but I reckon you take a sifter of plaster of Paris and a little dough and saleratus and cornmeal and mix them with eggs and buttermilk as usual. Is Old Bill going to ship beeves to Kansas City again this spring, Judd? That was all the pancake specifications I could get that night. I didn't wonder that Jackson Bird found it uphill work. So I dropped the subject and talked with Uncle Emsley for a while about hollowhorn and cyclones. And then Miss Willella came and said good night, and I hit the breeze for the ranch. About a week afterward, I met Jackson Bird riding out of Pimienta as I rode in, and we stopped on the road for a few frivolous remarks. Got the bill of particulars for them flapjacks yet? I asked him. Well, no, says Jackson. I don't seem to have any success in getting hold of it. Did you try? I did, says I, and 'twas like trying to dig a prairie dog out of his hole with a peanut hull. That pancake receipt must be a jucolorum, the way they hold on to it. I'm most ready to give it up, says Jackson, so discouraged in his pronunciations that I felt sorry for him. But I did want to know how to make them pancakes to eat on my lonely ranch, says he. I lie awake at nights thinking how good they are. You keep on trying for it, I tells him, and I'll do the same. One of us is bound to get a rope over its horns before long. Well, so long, Jacksy. You see, by this time we were on the peacefullest of terms. When I saw that he wasn't after Miss Willella, I had more endurable contemplations of that sandy-haired snoozer. In order to help out the ambitions of his appetite, I kept on trying to get that receipt from Miss Willella. But every time I would say pancakes, she would get sort of remote and fidgety about the eye and try to change the subject. If I held her to it, she would slide out and round up Uncle Emsley with his pitcher of water and hip pocket howitzer. One day, I galloped over to the store with a fine bunch of blue verbenas that I cut out of a herd of wild flowers over on Poison Dog Prairie. Uncle Emsley looked at him with one eye shut and says, "Haven't ye heard the news?" "Cattle up?" I asks. "Willella and Jackson Bird was married in Palestine yesterday," says he. "Just got a letter this morning." I dropped them flowers in a Cracker Barrel and let the news trickle in my ears and down toward my upper left-hand shirt pocket until it got to my feet. "Would you mind saying that over again once more, Uncle Emsley?" says I. "Maybe my hearing has got wrong, and you only said that prime heifers was 4.80 on the hoof, or something like that." "Married yesterday," says Uncle Emsley, "and gone to Waco and Niagara Falls on a wedding tour." "Why, didn't you see none of the signs all along? Jackson Bird has been courting Willella ever since that day he took her out riding." "Then," says I, in a kind of yell, "what was all this zitzaparula he gives me about pancakes? Tell me that." When I said pancakes, Uncle Emsley sort of dodged and stepped back. "Somebody's been dealing me pancakes from the bottom of the deck," I says, "and I'll find out. I believe you know. Talk up," says I, "or we'll mix a panful of batter right here." I slid over the counter after Uncle Emsley. He grabbed at his gun, but it was in a drawer, and he missed it 2 inches. I got him by the front of his shirt and shoved him in a corner. "Talk pancakes," says I, "or be made into one. Does Miss Willella make 'em?" "She never made one in her life, and I never saw one," says Uncle Emsley, soothing. "Calm down now, Judd, calm down. You've got excited, and that wound in your head is contaminating your sense of intelligence. Try not to think about pancakes." "Uncle Emsley," says I, "I'm not wounded in the head except so far as my natural cognitive instincts run to runts. Jackson Bird told me he was calling on Miss Willella for the purpose of finding out her system of producing pancakes, and he asked me to help him get the bill of lading of the ingredients. I done so, with the results as you see. Have I been sodded down with Johnson grass by a pink-eyed snoozer, or what?" "Slack up your grip in my dress shirt," says Uncle Emsley, "and I'll tell you. Yes, it looks like Jackson Bird is gone and humbugged you some. The day after he went riding with Willella, he came back and told me and her to watch out for you whenever you got to talking about pancakes. He said you was in camp once where they was cooking flapjacks, and one of the fellows cut you over the head with a frying pan. Jackson said that whenever you got overhot or excited, that wound hurt you and made you kind of crazy, and you went raving about pancakes. He told us to just get you worked off of the subject and soothed down, and you wouldn't be dangerous. So, me and Willella done the best by you we knew how." Well, says Uncle Emsley, "that Jackson Bird is sure a seldom kind of a snoozer." During the progress of Judd's story, he had been slowly but deftly combining certain portions of the contents of his sacks and cans. Toward the close of it, he set before me the finished product, a pair of red-hot, rich-hued pancakes on a tin plate. From some secret hoarding, he also brought a lump of excellent butter and a bottle of golden syrup. "How long ago did these things happen?" I asked him. 3 years, said Judd. "They're living on the Mired Mule Ranch now, but I haven't seen either of them since. They say Jackson Bird was fixing his ranch up fine with rocking chairs and window curtains all the time he was putting me up the pancake tree. Oh, I got over it after a while, but the boys kept the racket up." "Did you make these cakes by the famous recipe?" I asked. "Didn't I tell you there wasn't no receipt?" said Judd. "The boys hollered pancakes till they got pancake hungry, and I cut this recipe out of a newspaper. How does the truck taste?" "They're delicious," I answered. "Why don't you have some, too, Judd?" I was sure I heard a sigh. "Me," said Judd. "I don't ever eat 'em." The Phonograph and the Graft by O. Henry. "What was this graft?" asked Johnny, with the impatience of the great public to whom tales are told. "'Tis contrary to art and philosophy to give you the information," said Keogh, calmly. "The art of narrative consists in concealing from your audience everything it wants to know until after you expose your favorite opinions on topics foreign to the subject. A good story is like a bitter pill with the sugar coating inside of it. I will begin, if you please, with a horoscope located in the Cherokee Nation, and end with a moral tune on the phonograph. Me and Henry Horsecalla brought the first phonograph to this country. Henry was a quarter-breed, quarterback Cherokee, educated east in the idioms of football In Weston contraband whiskey, and a gentleman, the same as you and me. He was easy and romping in his ways. A man about 6 foot, with a kind of rubber tire movement. Yes, he was a little man about 5'5", or 5'11". He was what you would call a medium-tall man of average smallness. Henry had quit college once, and the Muskogee jail 3 times, the last named institution on account of introducing and selling whiskey in the territories. Henry Horsecollar never let any cigar stores come up and stand behind him. He didn't belong to that tribe of Indians. Henry and me met at Texarkana and figured out this phonograph scheme. He had $360 which came to him out of a land allotment in the reservation. I had run down from Little Rock on account of a distressful scene I had witnessed on the street there. A man stood on a box and passed around some gold watches, screw case, stem winders, Elgin movement, very elegant. $20 they cost you over the counter. At $3 the crowd fought for the tickers. The man happened to find a valise full of them handy, and he passed them out like putting hot biscuits on a plate. The backs were hard to unscrew, but the crowd put its ear to the case, and they ticked mollifying and agreeable. 3 of these watches were genuine tickers. The rest were only kickers. Hey? Why? Empty cases with one of them horny black bugs that fly around electric lights in 'em. Them bugs kick off minutes and seconds industrious and beautiful. So, this man I was speaking of cleaned up $288, and then he went away, because he knew that when it came time to wind watches in Little Rock an entomologist would be needed, and he wasn't one. So, as I say, Henry had $360 and I had $288. The idea of introducing the phonograph to South America was Henry's, but I took to it freely, being fond of machinery of all kinds. The Latin races, says Henry, explaining easy in the idioms he learned at college, are peculiarly adapted to be victims of the phonograph. They yearn for music and color and gaiety. They give wampum to the hand organ man and the 4-legged chicken in the tent when they're 3 months behind with the grocery and the breadfruit tree. Then, says I, we'll export kin music to the Latins, but I'm mindful of Mr. Julius Caesar's account of him where he says, Omnia Gallia in tres partes divisa est, which is the same as to say, we will need all of our gall in devising means to tree them parties. I hated to make a show of education, but I was disinclined to be overdone in syntax by a mere Indian, a member of a race to which we own nothing except the land on which the United States is situated. We bought a fine phonograph in Texarkana, one of the best make, and half a trunk full of records. We packed up and took the T&P for New Orleans. From that celebrated center of molasses and disfranchised coon songs, we took a steamer for South America. We landed at Solitas, 40 miles up the coast from here. 'Twas a palatable enough place to look at. The houses were clean and white, and to look at 'em stuck around among the scenery they reminded you of hard-boiled eggs served with lettuce. There was a block of skyscraper mountains in the suburbs, and they kept pretty quiet, like they had crept up there and were watching the town. And the sea was remarking shshsh on the beach, and now and then a ripe coconut would drop kerblip in the sand. And that was all there was doing. Yes, I judged that town was considerably on the quiet. I judged that after Gabriel quits blowing his horn, and the car starts, with Philadelphia swinging to the last strap, and Pine Gully, Arkansas, hanging onto the rear step, this town of Solitas will wake up and ask if anybody spoke. The captain went ashore with us, and offered to conduct what he seemed to like to call the obsequies. He introduced Henry and me to the United States consul and a roan man, the head of the Department of Mercenary and Licentious Dispositions, the way it read upon his sign. I vouch here again a week from today, says the captain. By that time, we told him, we'll be amassing wealth in the interior towns with our galvanized prima donna and correct imitations of Sousa's band excavating a march from a tin mine. You'll not, says the captain. You'll be hypnotized. Any gentleman in the audience who kindly steps upon the stage and looks this country in the eye will be converted to the hypothesis that he's but a fly in the Elgin Creamery. You'll be standing knee-deep in the surf waiting for me, and your machine for making hamburgers steak out of the hitherto respected art of music will be playing There's No Place Like Home. Henry skinned a 20 off his roll, and received from the Bureau of Mercenary Dispositions a paper bearing a red seal and a dialect story and no change. Then we got the console full of red wine and struck him for a horoscope. He was a thin, youngish kind of man. I should say past 50, sort of French-Irish in his affections, and puffed up with disconsolation. Yes, he was a flattened kind of man, in whom drink lay stagnant, inclined to corpulence and misery. Yes, I think he was a kind of Dutchman, being very sad and genial in his ways. The marvelous invention, he says, entitled the phonograph, has never invaded these shores. The people have never heard it. They would not believe it if they should. Simple-hearted children of nature, progress has never condemned them to accept the work of a can-opener as an overture, and ragtime might incite them to a bloody revolution. But you can try the experiment. The best chance you have is that the populace may not wake up when you play. There's two ways, says the consul, they may take it. They may become inebriated with attention, like an Atlanta colonel listening to Marching Through Georgia, or they will get excited and transpose the key of the music with an axe and yourselves into a dungeon. In the latter case, says the consul, I'll do my duty by cabling to the State Department, and I'll wrap the stars and stripes around you when you come to be shot, and threaten them with the vengeance of the greatest gold export and financial reserve nation on earth. The flag is full of bullet holes now, says the consul, made in that way. Twice before, says the consul, I have cabled our government for a couple of gunboats to protect American citizens. The first time the department sent me a pair of gumboots. The other time was when a man named Pease was going to be executed here. They referred that appeal to the Secretary of Agriculture. Let us now disturb the senor behind the bar for a subsequence of the red wine. Thus soliloquized the consul of Solitas to me and Henry Horsecalla. But, notwithstanding, we hired a room that afternoon in the Calle de Los Angeles, the main street that runs along the shore, and put our trunks there. 'Twas a good-sized room, dark and cheerful, but small. 'Twas on a various street, diversified by houses and conservatory plants. The peasantry of the city passed to and fro on the fine pasturage between the sidewalks. 'Twas, for the world, like an opera chorus when the royal Kafuzlum is about to enter. We were rubbing the dust off the machine and getting fixed to start business the next day, when a big, fine-looking white man in white clothes stopped at the door and looked in. We extended the invitations, and he walked inside and sized us up. He was chewing a long cigar, and wrinkling his eyes, meditative, like a girl trying to decide which dress to wear to the party. New York, he says to me finally. Originally, and from time to time, I says, hasn't it rubbed off yet? It's simple, says he, when you know how. It's the fit of the vest. They don't cut vests right anywhere else. Coats, maybe, but not vests. The white man looks at Henry Horsecalla and hesitates. Injun, says Henry, tame Injun. Mellinger, says the man Homer P. Mellinger. Boys, you're confiscated. You're babes in the wood without a chaperone or referee, and it's my duty to start you going. I'll knock out the props and launch you proper in the pellucid waters of this tropical mud puddle. You'll have to be christened, and if you'll come with me, I'll break a bottle of wine across your bows, according to Hoyle. Well, for 2 days Homer P. Mellinger did the honors. That man cut ice in Ancuria. He was it. He was the royal Kafuzlum. If me and Henry was babes in the wood, he was a robin redbreast from the topmost bough. Him and me and Henry Horsecalla locked arms, and toted that phonograph around, and had wassail and diversions. Everywhere we found doors open we went inside and set the machine going, and Mellinger called upon the people to observe the artful music and his two lifelong friends, the Señores Americanos. The opera chorus was agitated with esteem, and followed us from house to house. There was a different kind of drink to be had with every tune. The natives had acquirements of a pleasant thing in the way of a drink that gums itself to the recollection. They chop off the end of a green coconut and pour in on the juice of it French brandy and other adjuvants. We had them in other things. Mine and Henry's money was counterfeit. Everything was on Homer P. Mellinger. That man could find rolls of bills concealed in places on his person where Hermann the Wizard couldn't have conjured out a rabbit or an omelet. He could have founded universities and made orchid collections, and then had enough left to purchase the colored vote of his country. Henry and me wondered what his graft was. One evening he told us, Boys, said he, I've deceived you. You think I'm a painted butterfly, but in fact I'm the hardest worked man in this country. 10 years ago I landed on its shores, and 2 years ago on the point of its jaw. Yes, I guess I can get the decision over this ginger cake commonwealth at the end of any round I choose. I'll confide in you because you are my countrymen and guests, even if you have assaulted my adopted shores with the worst system of noises ever set to music. My job is private secretary to the president of this republic, and my duties are running it. I'm not headlined in the bills, but I'm the mustard in the salad dressing just the same. There isn't a law goes before Congress, there isn't a concession granted, there isn't an import duty levied, but what H.P. Mellinger he cooks and seasons it. In the front office I fill the president's inkstand and search visiting statesmen for dirks and dynamite. But in the back room I dictate the policy of the government. You'd never guess in the world how I got my pull. It's the only graft of its kind on earth. I'll put you wise. You remember the old top-liner in the copybook? Honesty is the best policy? That's it. I'm working honestly for a graft. I'm the only honest man in the republic. The government knows it. The people know it. The boodlers know it. The foreign investors know it. I make the government keep its faith. If a man is promised a job, he gets it. If outside capital buys a concession, it gets the goods. I run the monopoly of square dealing here. There's no competition. If Colonel Diogenes were to flash his lantern in this precinct, he'd have my address inside of 2 minutes. There isn't big money in it, but it's a sure thing, and lets a man sleep of nights. Thus Homer P. Mellinger made oration to me and Henry Horskala, and later, he divested himself of this remark. Boys, I'm to hold a soiree this evening with a gang of leading citizens, and I want your assistance. You bring the musical corn sheller, and give the affair the outside appearance of a function. There's important business on hand, but it mustn't show. I can talk to you people. I've been pained for years on account of not having anybody to blow off and brag to. I get homesick sometimes, and I'd swap the entire perquisites of office for just 1 hour to have a stein and a caviar sandwich somewhere on 34th Street, and stand and watch the streetcars go by, and smell the peanut roaster at old Giuseppe's fruit stand. Yes, said I. There's fine caviar at Billy Renfrew's Cafe, corner of 34th and... God knows it, interrupts Mellinger. And if you told me you knew Billy Renfrew, I'd have invented tons of ways of making you happy. Billy was my sidekicker in New York. There is a man who never knew what crooked was. Here I am working honesty for a graft, but that man loses money on it. Carambos. I get sick at times of this country. Everything's rotten. From the executive down to the coffee pickers, they're plotting to down each other and skin their friends. If a mule driver takes off his hat to an official, that man figures it out that he's a popular idol and set his pegs to stir up a revolution and upset the administration. It's one of my little chores as private secretary to smell out these revolutions and affix the kibosh before they break out and scratch the paint off the government property. That's why I'm down here now in this mildewed coast town. The governor of the district and his crew are plotting to uprise. I've got every one of their names, and they're invited to listen to the phonograph tonight. Compliments of H.P.M. That's the way I'll get them in a bunch, and things are on the program to happen to them. We three were sitting at table in the cantina of the Purified Saints. Mellinger poured out wine, and was looking some worried. I was thinking, they're a sharp crowd, he says, kind of fretful. They're capitalized by a foreign syndicate after rubber, and they're loaded to the muzzle for bribing. I'm sick, goes on Mellinger, of comic opera. I want to smell East River and wear suspenders again. At times I feel loke throwing up my job, but I'm d***ing fool enough to be sort of proud of it. There's Mellinger, they say here. Poor Dios, you can't touch him with $1 million. I'd like to take that record back and show it to Billy Renfrew someday, and that tightens my grip whenever I see a fat thing that I could corral just by winking one eye and losing my graft. Bye, they can't monkey with me. They know it. What money I get I make honest and spend it. Someday, I'll make a pile and go back and eat caviar with Billy. Tonight, I'll show you how to handle a bunch of corruptionists. I'll show them what Mellinger, private secretary, means when you spell it with the cotton and tissue paper off. Mellinger appears shaky and breaks his glass against the neck of the bottle. I says to myself, White man, if I'm not mistaken, there's been a bait laid out where the tail of your eye could see it. That night, according to arrangements, me and Henry took the phonograph to a room in a dobe house in a dirty side street, where the grass was knee-high. 'Twas a long room, lit with smoky oil lamps. There was plenty of chairs, and a table at the back end. We set the phonograph on the table. Mellinger was there, walking up and down, disturbed in his predicaments. He chewed cigars and spat him out, and he bit the thumbnail of his left hand. By and by the invitations to the musicale come sliding in by pairs and threes and spade flushes. Their color was of a diversity, running from a 3 days smoked meerschaum to a patent leather polish. They were as polite as wax, being devastated with enjoyments to give Senor Mellinger the good evenings. I understood their Spanish talk. I ran a pumping engine 2 years in a Mexican silver mine, and had it pat, but I never let on. Maybe 50 of them had come, and was seated, when in slid the King Bee, the governor of the district. Mellinger met him at the door, and escorted him to the grandstand. When I saw that Latin man, I knew that Mellinger, private secretary, had all the dances on his card taken. That was a big, squashy man, the color of a rubber overshoe, and he had an eye like a head waiter's. Mellinger explained, fluent, in the Castilian idioms, that his soul was disconcerted with joy at introducing to his respected friends America's greatest invention, the wonder of the age. Henry got the cue and run on an elegant brass band record, and the festivities became initiated. The governor man had a bit of English under his hat, and when the music was choked off he says, "Ver are refined, per Horatius, the American gentleman, the so is splendid music as to play e." The table was a long one, and Henry and me sat at the end of it next the wall. The governor sat at the other end. Homer P. Mellinger stood at the side of it. I was just wondering how Mellinger was going to handle his crowd, when the home talent suddenly opened the services. That governor man was suitable for uprisings and policies. I judge he was a ready kind of man, who took his own time. Yes, he was full of attention and immediateness. He leaned his hands on the table and imposed his face toward the secretary man. "Do the American senors understand Spanish?" he asks in his native accents. "They do not," says Mellinger. "Then listen," goes on the Latin man prompt. "The musics are of sufficient prettiness, but not of necessity. Let us speak of business. I will know why we are here, since I observe my compatriots. You had a whisper yesterday, Senor Mellinger, of our proposals. Tonight we will speak out. We know that you stand in the president's favor, and we know your influence. The government will be changed. We know the worth of your services. We esteem your friendship and aid so much that Mellinger praises his hand, but the governor man bottles him up. Do not speak until I have done." The governor man then draws a package wrapped in paper from his pocket and lays it on the table by Mellinger's hand. "In that you will find $50,000 in money of your country. You can do nothing against us, but you can be worth that for us. Go back to the capital and obey our instructions. Take that money now. We trust you. You will find with it a paper giving in detail the work you will be expected to do for us. Do not have the unwiseness to refuse." The governor man paused, with his eyes fixed on Mellinger, full of expressions and observances. I looked at Mellinger, and was glad Billy Renfrew couldn't see him then. The sweat was popping out on his forehead, and he stood dumb, tapping the little package with the ends of his fingers. The Colorado Maduro gang was after his graft. He had only to change his politics and stuff 5 fingers in his inside pocket. Henry whispers to me, and wants the pause in the program interpreted. I whisper back, "H.P. is up against a bribe, senator's size, and the coons have got him going." I saw Mellinger's hand moving closer to the package. "He's weakening," I whispered to Henry. "We'll remind him," says Henry, "of the peanut roaster on 34th Street, New York." Henry stooped down and got a record from the basketful we'd brought, slid it in the phonograph, and started her off. It was a cornet solo, very neat and beautiful, and the name of it was Home, Sweet Home. Not one of them 50-odd men in the room moved while it was playing, and the governor man kept his eyes steady on Mellinger. I saw Mellinger's head go up little by little, and his hand came creeping away from the package. Not until the last note sounded did anybody stir. And there Homer P. Mellinger takes up the bundle of boodle and slams it in the governor man's face. "That's my answer," says Mellinger, private secretary, "and there'll be another in the morning. I have proofs of conspiracy against every man of you. The show is over, gentlemen. There's one more act," puts in the governor man. "You are a servant, I believe, employed by the president to copy letters and answer raps at the door. I am governor here. Señores, I call upon you in the name of the cause to seize this man." That brindled gang of conspirators shoved back their chairs and advanced in force. I could see where Mellinger had made a mistake in massing his enemy so as to make a grandstand play. I think he made another one, too. But we can pass that. Mellinger's idea of a graft and mine being different, according to estimations and points of view. There was only one window and door in that room, and they were in the front end. Here was 50-odd Latin men coming in a bunch to obstruct the legislation of Mellinger. You may say there were 3 of us, for me and Henry, simultaneous, declared New York City and the Cherokee Nation in sympathy with the weaker party. Then it was that Henry Horsecollar rose to a point of disorder and intervened, showing, admirable, the advantages of education as applied to the American Indian's natural intellect and native refinement. He stood up and smoothed back his hair on each side with his hands, as you have seen little girls do when they play. "Get behind me, both of you," says Henry. "What's it to be, Chief?" I asked. "I'm going to Buck Center," says Henry, in his football idioms. "There isn't a tackle in the lot of them. Follow me close and rush the game." Then that cultured red man exhaled an arrangement of sounds with his mouth that made the Latin aggregation pause, with thoughtfulness and hesitations. The matter of his proclamation seemed to be a cooperation of the Carlisle war whoop with the Cherokee College yell. He went at the chocolate team like a bean out of a little boy's nigger shooter. His right elbow laid out the governor man on the gridiron, and he made a lane the length of the crowd so wide that a woman could have carried a stepladder through it without striking against anything. All Mellinger and me had to do was to follow. It took us just 3 minutes to get out of that street around a military headquarters, where Mellinger had things his own way. A colonel and a battalion of bare-toed infantry turned out and went back to the scene of the musicale with us, but the conspirator gang was gone. But we recaptured the phonograph with honors of war, and marched back to the cuartel with it playing "All Coons Look Alike to Me." The next day Mellinger takes me and Henry to one side, and begins to shed 10s and 20s. "I want to buy that phonograph," says he. "I liked that last tune it played at the soiree." "This is more money than the machine is worth," says I. "'Tis government expense money," says Mellinger. "The government pays for it, and it's getting the tune grinder cheap." Me and Henry knew that pretty well. We knew that it had saved Homer P. Mellinger's graft when he was on the point of losing it, but we never let him know we knew it. "Now you boys better slide off further down the coast for a while," says Mellinger, "till I get the screws put on these fellows here. If you don't, they'll give you trouble. And if you ever happen to see Billy Renfrew again before I do, tell him I'm coming back to New York as soon as I can make a steak honest." Me and Henry laid low until the day the steamer came back. When we saw the captain's boat on the beach, we went down and stood in the edge of the water. The captain grinned when he saw us. "I told you you'd be waiting," he says. "Where's the hamburger machine?" "It stays behind," I says, "to play Home, Sweet Home." "I told you so," says the captain again. "Climb in the boat." And that, said Keogh, is the way me and Henry Horsecollar introduced the phonograph into this country. Henry went back to the States, but I've been rummaging around in the tropics ever since. They say Mellinger never traveled a mile after that without his phonograph. I guess it kept him reminded about his graft whenever he saw the siren voice of the boodler tip him the wink with a bribe in his hand. "I suppose he's taking it home with him as a souvenir," remarked the consul. "Not as a souvenir," said Keogh. "He'll need 2 of him in New York, running day and night." The Pendulum, by O. Henry. 81st Street, let him out, please, yelled the shepherd in blue. A flock of citizen sheep scrambled out, and another flock scrambled aboard. Ding ding. The cattle cars of the Manhattan Elevated rattled away, and John Perkins drifted down the stairway of the station with the released flock. John walked slowly toward his flat. Slowly, because in the lexicon of his daily life, there was no such word as perhaps. There are no surprises awaiting a man who has been married 2 years and lives in a flat. As he walked, John Perkins prophesied to himself with gloomy and downtrodden cynicism the foregone conclusions of the monotonous day. Katie would meet him at the door with a kiss flavored with cold cream and butterscotch. He would remove his coat, sit upon a macadamized lounge and read, in the evening paper, of Russians and Japs slaughtered by the deadly linotype. For dinner, there would be pot roast, a salad flavored with a dressing warranted not to crack or injure the leather, stewed rhubarb, and the bottle of strawberry marmalade blushing at the certificate of chemical purity on its label. After dinner, Katie would show him the new patch in her crazy quilt that the iceman had cut for her off the end of his four-in hand. At 7:30, they would spread newspapers over the furniture to catch the pieces of plastering that fell when the fat man in the flat overhead began to take his physical culture exercises. Exactly at 8 Hickey and Amp, Mooney, of the vaudeville team, unbooked, in the flat across the hall, would yield to the gentle influence of delirium tremens and begin to overturn chairs under the delusion that Hammerstein was pursuing them with a $500-a-week contract. Then the gent at the window across the airshaft would get out his flute. The nightly gas leak would steal forth to frolic in the highways. The dumbwaiter would slip off its trolley. The janitor would drive Mrs. Zanowitzki's 5 children once more across the Yalu. The lady with the champagne shoes and the Skye Terrier would trip downstairs and paste her Thursday name over her bell and letterbox, and the evening routine of the Frogmore Flats would be underway. John Perkins knew these things would happen, and he knew that at 8:15 he would summon his nerve and reach for his hat, and that his wife would deliver this speech in a querulous tone. "Now, where are you going, I'd like to know, John Perkins?" "Thought I'd drop up to McCloskey's," he would answer, "and play a game or two of pool with the fellows." Of late, such had been John Perkins's habit. At 10 or 11 he would return. Sometimes Katie would be asleep. Sometimes waiting up, ready to melt in the crucible of her ire a little more gold plating from the wrought steel chains of matrimony. For these things Cupid will have to answer when he stands at the bar of justice with his victims from the Frogmore Flats. Tonight John Perkins encountered a tremendous upheaval of the commonplace when he reached his door. No Katie was there with her affectionate, confectionate kiss. The 3 rooms seemed in portentous disorder. All about lay her things in confusion. Shoes in the middle of the floor, curling tongs, hair bows, kimonos, powder box, jumbled together on dresser and chairs. This was not Katie's way. With a sinking heart, John saw the comb with a curling cloud of her brown hair among its teeth. Some unusual hurry and perturbation must have possessed her, for she always carefully placed these combings in the little blue vase on the mantel to be some day formed into the coveted feminine rat. Hanging conspicuously to the gas jet by a string was a folded paper. John seized it. It was a note from his wife running thus: "Dear John, I just had a telegram saying Mother is very sick. I am going to take the 4.30 train. Brother Sam is going to meet me at the depot there. There is cold mutton in the icebox. I hope it isn't her Quincy again. Pay the milkman 50 cents. She had it bad last spring. Don't forget to write to the company about the gas meter, and your good socks are in the top drawer. I will write tomorrow." Hastily, Katie. Never during their 2 years of matrimony had he and Katie been separated for a night. John read the note over and over in a dumbfounded way. Here was a break in a routine that had never varied, and it left him dazed. There on the back of a chair hung, pathetically empty and formless, the red wrapper with black dots that she always wore while getting the meals. Her weekday clothes had been tossed here and there in her haste. A little paper bag of her favorite butterscotch lay with its string yet unwound. A daily paper sprawled on the floor, gaping rectangularly where a railroad timetable had been clipped from it. Everything in the room spoke of a loss, of an essence gone, of its soul and life departed. John Perkins stood among the dead remains with a queer feeling of desolation in his heart. He began to set the rooms tidy as well as he could. When he touched her clothes, a thrill of something like terror went through him. He had never thought what existence would be without Katie. She had become so thoroughly annealed into his life that she was like the air he breathed, necessary but scarcely noticed. Now, without warning, She was gone, vanished, as completely absent as if she had never existed. Of course, it would be only for a few days, or at most a week or two, but it seemed to him as if the very hand of death had pointed a finger at his secure and uneventful home. John dragged the cold mutton from the icebox, made coffee, and sat down to a lonely meal face to face with the strawberry marmalade's shameless certificate of purity. Bright among withdrawn blessings now appeared to him the ghosts of pot roasts and the salad with tan-polished dressing. His home was dismantled. A quinzied mother-in-law had knocked his Laura's and Panetti's sky high. After his solitary meal, John sat at a front window. He did not care to smoke. Outside, the city roared to him to come join in its dance of folly and pleasure. The night was his. He might go forth unquestioned and thrum the strings of jollity as free as any gay bachelor there. He might carouse and wander and have his fling until dawn if he liked, and there would be no wrathful Katie waiting for him, bearing the chalice that held the dregs of his joy. He might play pool at McCloskey's with his roistering friends until Aurora dimmed the electric bulbs if he chose. The hymeneal strings that had curbed him always when the Frogmore Flats had palled upon him were loosened. Katie was gone. John Perkins was not accustomed to analyzing his emotions, but as he sat in his Katie-bereft 10-by-12 parlor, he hit unerringly upon the keynote of his discomfort. He knew now that Katie was necessary to his happiness. His feeling for her, lulled into unconsciousness by the dull round of domesticity, had been sharply stirred by the loss of her presence. Has it not been dinned into us by proverb and sermon and fable that we never prize the music till the sweet-voiced bird has flown, or in other no less florid and true utterances? "I'm a double-dyed dub," mused John Perkins, "the way I've been treating Katie, off every night playing pool and bumming with the boys instead of staying home with her. The poor girl here all alone with nothing to amuse her, and me acting that way. John Perkins, you're the worst kind of a shine. I'm going to make it up for the little girl. I'll take her out and let her see some amusement, and I'll cut out the McCloskey gang right from this minute." Yes, there was the city roaring outside for John Perkins to come dance in the train of Momus. And at McCloskey's the boys were knocking the balls idly into the pockets against the hour for the nightly game. But no Primrose Way nor clicking cue could woo the remorseful soul of Perkins the bereft. The thing that was his, lightly held and half scorned, had been taken away from him, and he wanted it. Backward to a certain man named Adam, whom the cherubim bounced from the orchard, could Perkins, the remorseful, trace his descent. Near the right hand of John Perkins stood a chair. On the back of it stood Katie's blue shirtwaist. It still retained something of her contour. Midway of the sleeves were fine, individual wrinkles made by the movements of her arms in working for his comfort and pleasure. A delicate but impelling odor of bluebells came from it. John took it and looked long and soberly at the unresponsive grenadine. Katie had never been unresponsive. Tears, yes, tears came into John Perkins's eyes. When she came back, things would be different. He would make up for all his neglect. What was life without her? The door opened. Katie walked in carrying a little hand satchel. John stared at her stupidly. "My, I'm glad to get back," said Katie. "Ma wasn't sick to amount of anything. Sam was at the depot and said she just had a little spell and got all right soon after they telegraphed. So I took the next train back. I'm just dying for a cup of coffee." Nobody heard the click and rattle of the cogwheels as the third-floor front of the Frogmore Flats buzzed its machinery back into the order of things. A band slipped, a spring was touched, the gear was adjusted, and the wheels revolve in their old orbit. John Perkins looked at the clock. It was 8:15. He reached for his hat and walked to the door. "Now, where are you going, I'd like to know, John Perkins?" asked Katie, in a querulous tone. "Thought I'd drop up to McCloskey's," said John, "and play a game or two of pool with the fellows." The Passing of Black Eagle by O. Henry. For some months of a certain year, a grim bandit infested the Texas border along the Rio Grande. Peculiarly striking to the optic nerve was this notorious marauder. His personality secured him the title of Black Eagle, the terror of the border. Many fearsome tales are on record concerning the doings of him and his followers. Suddenly, in the space of a single minute, Black Eagle vanished from Earth. He was never heard of again. His own band never even guessed the mystery of his disappearance. The border ranches and settlements feared he would come again to ride and ravage the mesquite flats. He never will. It is to disclose the fate of Black Eagle that this narrative is written. The initial movement of the story is furnished by the foot of a bartender in St. Louis. His discerning eye fell upon the form of Chicken Ruggles as he pecked with avidity at the free lunch. Chicken was a hobo. He had a long nose like the bill of a fowl, an inordinate appetite for poultry, and a habit of gratifying it without expense, which accounts for the name given him by his fellow vagrants. Physicians agree that the partaking of liquids at meal times is not a healthy practice. The hygiene of the saloon promulgates the opposite. Chicken had neglected to purchase a drink to accompany his meal. The bartender rounded the counter, caught the injudicious diner by the ear with a lemon squeezer, led him to the door and kicked him into the street. Thus the mind of Chicken was brought to realize the signs of coming winter. The night was cold. The stars shone with unkindly brilliancy. People were hurrying along the streets in two egotistic, jostling streams. Men had donned their overcoats, and Chicken knew to an exact percentage the increased difficulty of coaxing dimes from those buttoned in vest pockets. The time had come for his annual exodus to the south. A little boy, 5 or 6 years old, stood looking with covetous eyes in a confectioner's window. In one small hand he held an empty 2-ounce vial. In the other he grasped tightly something flat and round, with a shining milled edge. The scene presented a field of operations commensurate to Chicken's talents and daring. After sweeping the horizon to make sure that no official tug was cruising near, he insidiously accosted his prey. The boy, having been early taught by his household to regard altruistic advances with extreme suspicion, received the overtures coldly. Then Chicken knew that he must make one of those desperate, nerve-shattering plunges into speculation that fortune sometimes requires of those who would win her favor. 5 cents was his capital, and this he must risk against the chance of winning what lay within the close grasp of the youngster's chubby hand. It was a fearful lottery, Chicken knew, but he must accomplish his end by strategy, since he had a wholesome terror of plundering infants by force. Once, in a park, driven by hunger, he had committed an onslaught upon a bottle of peptonized infant's food in the possession of an occupant of a baby carriage. The outraged infant had so promptly opened its mouth and pressed the button that communicated with the welkin that help arrived, and Chicken did his 30 days in a snug coop. Wherefore he was, as he said, leery of kids. Beginning artfully to question the boy concerning his choice of sweets, he gradually drew out the information he wanted. Mama said he was to ask the drugstore man for 10 cents worth of paregoric in the bottle. He was to keep his hand shut tight over the dollar. He must not stop to talk to anyone in the street. He must ask the drugstore man to wrap up the change and put it in the pocket of his trousers. Indeed, they had pockets 2 of them, and he liked chocolate creams best. Chicken went into the store and turned plunger. He invested his entire capital in C&Y stocks, simply to pave the way to the greater risk following. He gave the sweets to the youngster, and had the satisfaction of perceiving that confidence was established. After that it was easy to obtain leadership of the expedition, to take the investment by the hand, and lead it to a nice drugstore he knew of in the same block. There Chicken, with a parental air, passed over the dollar and called for the medicine, while the boy crunched his candy, glad to be relieved of the responsibility of the purchase. And then the successful investor, searching his pockets, found an overcoat button, the extent of his winter trousseau, and, wrapping it carefully, placed the ostensible change in the pocket of confiding juvenility. Setting the youngster's face homeward, and patting him benevolently on the back, for Chicken's heart was as soft as those of his feathered namesakes, the speculator quit the market with a profit of 1,700% on his invested capital. 2 hours later an Iron Mountain freight engine pulled out of the railroad yards, Texas-bound, with a string of empties. In one of the cattle cars, half buried in excelsior, Chicken lay at ease. Beside him in his nest was a quart bottle of very poor whiskey and a paper bag of bread and cheese. Mr. Ruggles, in his private car, was on his trip south for the winter season. For a week that car was trundled southward, shifted, laid over, and manipulated after the manner of rolling stock, but Chicken stuck to it, leaving it only at necessary times to satisfy his hunger and thirst. He knew it must go down to the cattle country, and San Antonio, in the heart of it, was his goal. There the air was salubrious and mild, the people indulgent and long-suffering. The bartenders there would not kick him. If he should eat too long or too often at one place, they would swear at him as if by rote and without heat. They swore so drawlingly, and they rarely paused short of their full vocabulary, which was copious, so that Chicken had often gulped a good meal during the process of the vituperative prohibition. The season there was always spring-like. The plazas were pleasant at night, with music and gaiety. Except during the slight and infrequent cold snaps, one could sleep comfortably out of doors in case the interiors should develop inhospitability. At Texarkana his car was switched to the I&GN. Then still southward it trailed until, at length, it crawled across the Colorado Bridge at Austin and lined out, straight as an arrow, for the run to San Antonio. When the freight halted at that town, Chicken was fast asleep. In 10 minutes the train was off again for Laredo, the end of the road. Those empty cattle cars were for distribution along the line at points from which the ranches shipped their stock. When Chicken awoke, his car was stationary. Looking out between the slats, he saw it was a bright, moonlit night. Scrambling out, he saw his car with 3 others abandoned on a little siding in a wild and lonesome country. A cattle pen and chute stood on one side of the track. The railroad bisected a vast, dim ocean of prairie, in the midst of which Chicken, with his feudal rolling stock, was as completely stranded as was Robinson with his landlocked boat. A white post stood near the rails. Going up to it, Chicken read the letters at the top, S.A. 90. Laredo was nearly as far to the south. He was almost 100 miles from any town. Coyotes began to yelp in the mysterious sea around him. Chicken felt lonesome. He had lived in Boston without an education, in Chicago without nerve, in Philadelphia without a sleeping place, in New York without a pole, and in Pittsburgh sober, and yet he had never felt so lonely as now. Suddenly, through the intense silence, he heard the whicker of a horse. The sound came from the side of the track toward the east, and Chicken began to explore timorously in that direction. He stepped high along the mat of curly mesquite grass, for he was afraid of everything there might be in this wilderness: snakes, rats, brigands, centipedes, mirages, cowboys, fandangos, tarantulas, tamales. He had read of them in the story papers. Rounding a clump of prickly pear that reared high its fantastic and menacing array of rounded heads, he was struck to shivering terror by a snort and a thunderous plunge, as the horse, himself startled, bounded away some 50 yards, and then resumed his grazing. But here was the one thing in the desert that Chicken did not fear. He had been reared on a farm. He had handled horses, understood them, and could ride. Approaching slowly and speaking soothingly, he followed the animal, which, after its first flight, seemed gentle enough, and secured the end of the 20-foot lariat that dragged after him in the grass. It required him but a few moments to contrive the rope into an ingenious nose bridle, after the style of the Mexican/Borsal/. In another, he was upon the horse's back and off at a splendid lope, giving the animal free choice of direction. "He will take me somewhere," said Chicken to himself. It would have been a thing of joy, that untrammeled gallop over the moonlit prairie, even to Chicken, who loathed exertion, but that his mood was not for it. His head ached. A growing thirst was upon him. The somewhere whither his lucky mount might convey him was full of dismal peradventure. And now he noted that the horse moved to a definite goal. Where the prairie lay smooth, he kept his course straight as an arrow's toward the east. Deflected by hill or arroyo or impractical spinous breaks, he quickly flowed again into the current, charted by his unerring instinct. At last, upon the side of a gentle rise, he suddenly subsided to a complacent walk. A stone's cast away stood a little knot of coma trees. Beneath it a jackal such as the Mexicans erect, one room house of upright poles daubed with clay and roofed with grass or tule reeds. An experienced eye would have estimated the spot as the headquarters of a small sheep ranch. In the moonlight, the ground in the nearby corral showed pulverized to a level smoothness by the hoofs of the sheep. Everywhere was carelessly distributed the paraphernalia of the place: ropes, bridles, saddles, sheep pelts, wool sacks, feed troughs, and camp litter. The barrel of drinking water stood in the end of the two-horse wagon near the door. The harness was piled, promiscuous, upon the wagon tongue, soaking up the dew. Chicken slipped to earth and tied the horse to a tree. He hallooed again and again, but the house remained quiet. The door stood open, and he entered cautiously. The light was sufficient for him to see that no one was at home. The room was that of a bachelor ranchman who was content with the necessaries of life. Chicken rummaged intelligently until he found what he had hardly dared hope for, a small, brown jug that still contained something near a quart of his desire. Half an hour later, Chicken, now a gamecock of hostile aspect, emerged from the house with unsteady steps. He had drawn upon the absent ranchman's equipment to replace his own ragged attire. He wore a suit of coarse brown ducking, the coat being a sort of rakish bolero, jaunty to a degree. Boots he had donned, and spurs that whirred with every lurching step. Buckled around him was a belt full of cartridges with a big six-shooter in each of its two holsters. Prowling about, he found blankets, a saddle and bridle with which he caparisoned his steed. Again mounting, he rode swiftly away, singing a loud and tuneless song. Bud King's band of desperados, outlaws and horse and cattle thieves were in camp at a secluded spot on the bank of the Frio. Their depredations in the Rio Grande country, while no bolder than usual, had been advertised more extensively, and Captain Kinney's company of rangers had been ordered down to look after them. Consequently, Bud King, who was a wise general, instead of cutting out a hot trail for the upholders of the law, as his men wished to do, retired for the time to the prickly fastnesses of the Frio Valley. Though the move was a prudent one, and not incompatible with Bud's well-known courage, it raised dissension among the members of the band. In fact, while they thus lay ingloriously /Purdue/ in the brush, the question of Bud King's fitness for the leadership was argued, with closed doors, as it were, by his followers. Never before had Bud's skill or efficiency been brought to criticism, but his glory was wandering, and such is glory's fate, in the light of a newer star. The sentiment of the band was crystallizing into the opinion that Black Eagle could lead them with more luster, profit, and distinction. This Black Eagle, subtitled the Terror of the Border, had been a member of the gang about 3 months. One night, while they were in camp on the San Miguel waterhole, a solitary horseman on the regulation fiery steed dashed in among them. The newcomer was of a portentous and devastating aspect. A beak-like nose with a predatory curve projected above a mass of bristling, blue-black whiskers. His eye was cavernous and fierce. He was spurred, sombreroed, booted, garnished with revolvers, abundantly drunk, and very much unafraid. Few people in the country drained by the Rio Bravo would have cared thus to invade alone the camp of Bud King. But this fell bird swooped fearlessly upon them and demanded to be fed. Hospitality in the prairie country is not limited. Even if your enemy pass your way, you must feed him before you shoot him. You must empty your larder into him before you empty your lead. So the stranger of undeclared intentions was set down to a mighty feast. A talkative bird he was, full of most marvelous loud tales and exploits, and speaking a language at times obscure but never colorless. He was a new sensation to Bud King's men, who rarely encountered new types. They hung, delighted, upon his vainglorious boasting, the spicy strangeness of his lingo, his contemptuous familiarity with life, the world, and remote places, and the extravagant frankness with which he conveyed his sentiments. To their guest, the band of outlaws seemed to be nothing more than a congregation of country bumpkins whom he was stringing for grub, just as he would have told his stories at the back door of a farmhouse to wheedle a meal. And indeed, his ignorance was not without excuse, for the bad man of the Southwest does not run to extremes. Those brigands might justly have been taken for a little party of peaceable rustics assembled for a fish fry or pecan gathering. Gentle of manner, slouching of gait, soft-voiced, unpicturesquely clothed, not one of them presented to the eye any witness of the desperate records they had earned. For 2 days the glittering stranger within the camp was feasted. Then, by common consent, he was invited to become a member of the band. He consented, presenting for enrollment the prodigious name of Captain Montresor. This name was immediately overruled by the band, and piggy, substituted as a complement to the awful and insatiate appetite of its owner. Thus did the Texas border receive the most spectacular brigand that ever rode its chaparral. For the next 3 months Bud King conducted business as usual, escaping encounters with law officers and being content with reasonable profits. The band ran off some very good companies of horses from the ranges, and a few bunches of fine cattle which they got safely across the Rio Grande and disposed of to fair advantage. Often the band would ride into the little villages and Mexican settlements, terrorizing the inhabitants and plundering for the provisions and ammunition they needed. It was during these bloodless raids that Piggy's ferocious aspect and frightful voice gained him a renown more widespread and glorious than those other gentle-voiced and sad-faced desperados could have acquired in a lifetime. The Mexicans, most apt in nomenclature, first called him the Black Eagle, and used to frighten the babes by threatening them with tales of the dreadful robber who carried off little children in his great beak. Soon the name extended, and Black Eagle, the terror of the border, became a recognized factor in exaggerated newspaper reports and ranch gossip. The country from the Nueces to the Rio Grande was a wild but fertile stretch. Given over to the sheep and cattle ranches range was free. The inhabitants were few, the law was mainly a letter, and the pirates met with little opposition until the flaunting and garish Piggy gave the band undue advertisement. Then McKinney's Ranger Company headed for those precincts, and Bud King knew that it meant grim and sudden war or else temporary retirement. Regarding the risk to be unnecessary, he drew off his band to an almost inaccessible spot on the bank of the Frio. Wherefore, as has been said, dissatisfaction arose among the members, and impeachment proceedings against Bud were premeditated, with Black Eagle in high favor for the succession. Bud King was not unaware of the sentiment, and he called aside Cactus Taylor, his trusted lieutenant, to discuss it. "If the boys," said Bud, "ain't satisfied with me, I'm willing to step out. They're bucking against my way of handling 'em, and specially because I concludes to hit the brush while Sam Kinney is riding the line. I saves him from being shot or sent up on a state contract, and they up and says I'm no good. It ain't so much that," explained Cactus, "as it is they're plumb locoed about Piggy. They want them whiskers and that nose of his to split the wind at the head of the column." "There's something mighty seldom about Piggy," declared Bud, musingly. "I never yet see anything on the hoof that he exactly grades up with. He can sure holler a plenty, and he straddles a hoss from where you laid the chunk. But he ain't never been smoked yet. You know, Cactus, we ain't had a row since he's been with us. Piggy's all right for skeerin', the greaser kids and layin' waste a crossroads store. I reckon he's the finest can oyster buccaneer and cheese pirate that ever was, but how's his appetite for fightin'? I've knowed some citizens you'd think was starvin' for trouble get a bad case of dyspepsy the first dose of lead they had to take. He talks all spraddled out," said Cactus, "about the rookuses he's been in. He claims to have saw the elephant and hearn the owl." "I know," replied Bud, using the cowpuncher's expressive phrase of skepticism, "but it sounds to me." This conversation was held one night in camp, while the other members of the band 8 in number were sprawling around the fire, lingering over their supper. When Bud and Cactus ceased talking, they heard Piggy's formidable voice holding forth to the others as usual while he was engaged in checking, though never satisfying, his ravening appetite. "What's the use," he was saying, "of chasin' little red cowses and hosses round for thousands of miles? Deer ain't nuttin' in it. Gallopin' tear-rough dece bushes and briars, and gettin' a tears dat a brewery couldn't put out and missin' meals. Say, you know what I'd do if I was main finger of dis bunch? I'd stick up a train. I'd blow to express car and make hard dollars where you guys get wind. Yous makes me tired. Dis sookow kind of cheap sport gives me a pain." Later on, a deputation waited on Bud. They stood on one leg, chewed mesquite twigs and circumlocuted, for they hated to hurt his feelings. Bud foresaw their business and made it easy for them. Bigger risks and larger profits was what they wanted. The suggestion of Piggy's about holding up a train had fired their imagination and increased their admiration for the dash and boldness of the instigator. They were such simple, artless, and custom-bound bushrangers that they had never before thought of extending their habits beyond the running off of livestock and the shooting of such of their acquaintances as ventured to interfere. Bud acted on the level, agreeing to take a subordinate place in the gang until Black Eagle should have been given a trial as leader. After a great deal of consultation, studying of timetables, and discussion of the country's topography, the time and place for carrying out their new enterprise was decided upon. At that time, there was a feedstuff famine in Mexico and a cattle famine in certain parts of the United States, and there was a brisk international trade. Much money was being shipped along the railroads that connected the two republics. It was agreed that the most promising place for the contemplated robbery was at Espina, a little station on the I&GN, about 40 miles north of Laredo. The train stopped there 1 minute. The country around was wild and unsettled. The station consisted of but one house in which the agent lived. Black Eagle's band set out, riding by night. Arriving in the vicinity of Espina, they rested their horses all day in a thicket a few miles distant. The train was due at Espina at 10:30 p.m. They could rob the train and be well over the Mexican border with their booty by daylight the next morning. To do Black Eagle justice, he exhibited no signs of flinching from the responsible honors that had been conferred upon him. He assigned his men to their respective posts with discretion and coached them carefully as to their duties. On each side of the track, 4 of the band were to lie concealed in the chaparral. Gotchier Rogers was to stick up the station agent. Bronco Charlie was to remain with the horses, holding them in readiness. At a spot where it was calculated the engine would be when the train stopped, Bud King was to lie hidden on one side and Black Eagle himself on the other. The two would get the drop on the engineer and fireman, force them to descend and proceed to the rear. Then the express car would be looted and the escape made. No one was to move until Black Eagle gave the signal by firing his revolver. The plan was perfect. At 10 minutes to train time, every man was at his post, effectually concealed by the thick chaparral that grew almost to the rails. The night was dark and lowering, with a fine drizzle falling from the flying Gulf clouds. Black Eagle crouched behind a bush within 5 yards of the track. 2 6-shooters were belted around him. Occasionally, he drew a large black bottle from his pocket and raised it to his mouth. A star appeared far down the track, which soon waxed into the headlight of the approaching train. It came on with an increasing roar. The engine bore down upon the ambushing desperadoes with a glare and a shriek like some avenging monster come to deliver them to justice. Black Eagle flattened himself upon the ground. The engine, contrary to their calculations, instead of stopping between him and Bud King's place of concealment, passed fully 40 years farther before it came to a stand. The bandit leader rose to his feet and peered through the bush. His men all lay quiet, awaiting the signal. Immediately opposite Black Eagle was a thing that drew his attention. Instead of being a regular passenger train, it was a mixed one. Before him stood a boxcar, the door of which, by some means, had been left slightly open. Black Eagle went up to it and pushed the door farther open. An odor came forth, a damp, rancid, familiar, musty, intoxicating, beloved odor stirring strongly at old memories of happy days and travels. Black Eagle sniffed at the witching smell as the returned wanderer smells of the rose that twines his boyhood's cottage home. Nostalgia seized him. He put his hand inside. Excelsior, dry, springy, curly, soft, enticing, covered the floor. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a chilling rain. The train bell clanged. The bandit chief unbuckled his belt and cast it, with its revolvers, upon the ground. His spurs followed quickly, and his broad sombrero. Black Eagle was molting. The train started with a rattling jerk. The ex-terror of the border scrambled into the boxcar and closed the door. Stretched luxuriously upon the Excelsior, with the black bottle clasped closely to his breast, his eyes closed, and a foolish, happy smile upon his terrible features, Chicken Ruggles started upon his return trip. Undisturbed, with the band of desperate bandits lying motionless, awaiting the signal to attack, the train pulled out from Espina. As its speed increased, and the black masses of chaparral went whizzing past on either side, the express messenger, lighting his pipe, looked through his window and remarked, feelingly, "What a jim-dandy place for a hold-up.